Hello, guys. It's Adina, and we are actually on break from the Atheists in Recovery podcast. But I thought it would be fun to share some of my most popular episodes, as well as my favorite episodes from year one. For me, listening to some of these old episodes, I always pick up something new and learn something in addition to what I thought I already learned from the guests. And if it's a book review, I love going through a book and reviewing the pages upon pages of highlights and sussing out my favorite ideas that I feel are worth sharing. So before you go, don't forget to sign up for the weekly newsletter where we talk about learning to identify patterns of dysfunctional thinking, changing the dysfunctional thinking into something more positive. And I throw in a little homework for good measure, and you can find the link to sign up for the newsletter in the show notes. Okay, guys, I hope you enjoy this Encore episode.
Welcome to the Atheist in Recovery podcast, where we talk about finding hope in recovery. And now your host, Dr. Adina Silvestri.
Hello, and welcome to episode 6 of the Atheists in Recovery podcast. Today's episode was laugh out loud funny. I really had to bite my lip a couple times just because I wanted to get the interview, but I also I think you're also going to enjoy today's guest. So, Josie. Josie was a teenage alcoholic and drug user, and he learned via the oral tradition of sharing AA. So he talks a little bit about that versus going through the steps, the 12 steps. And also he talks about finding a higher purpose instead of a higher power, and that was the catalyst for his sobriety. Josie writes and is a podcast host at Rebellion Dogs, and he talks about addiction, recovery, and mental health. He is also the author of Beyond Belief, Agnostic Musings for 12-Step Life. And today he is going to talk about what it's like to be an atheist and agnostic in the AA world, and how do you succeed without having a higher power? Okay, I hope you enjoy today's show. Josie, welcome to the show.
I am so happy. Hello out there, atheists in recovery land.
So maybe you can talk a little bit about yourself for our listeners. Introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm in long-term recovery. If you're hooked on dates, I've been so clean and sober since disco, so you can look up when Rod Stewart's Tonight's the Night was a hit song. That's when I came around. It was the mid-'70s. And I got sober in Montreal, Canada, and to me, that was what AA was. The brand of AA they had there seemed like, well, isn't this what they do everywhere? And then I moved a lot. I was very young. I moved to Calgary for a summer and ended up getting a management position there. And I was there for 5 years. And AA was very different there. NA was slightly different there. I moved to Toronto, and Toronto's a very different AA culture. It's a very book-based society, and that's not what I was exposed to. I was more exposed to sort of the oral tradition of sharing AA, right? There wasn't these steps in this order by these instructions. That wasn't how I was schooled. And now I'm in an environment where that's normal for people, and I had to adjust to it. I traveled enough that I learned that they weren't going to adjust to me. They weren't waiting for me to bring the Montreal style of AA to everybody because they thought theirs was just fine. And also times change, right? We go through periods of being more conservative and more liberal. And I think one feeds the other. The Back to Basics movement has done more to create the secular AA movement than anything else because it's a reaction. It's one is very conservative, and so other people are going to start meetings that sort of react to that. A safe space for people who don't believe in a prayer answering, sobriety granting type of higher power, but still want fellowship, still want some sort of structure, maybe even a program for living. And in the secular AA community, there are those that outright reject the steps completely. I'm a 12-step fan. They can easily be understood in a secular narrative. But other people dismiss them as being as religious as the Lord's Prayer. And, they admit they're alcoholic. Sure, I'll help other alcoholics. The end, right? I didn't come here for a personality change. I came here to get sober. So I found myself in Toronto, sober a long time. What really sort of got me into sobriety was the young people's movement, because really when I went to AA for the first time, it wasn't the God thing that turned me off. It was the not drinking thing that turned me off. Drinking, as you will know, as any of your clients will know, as anyone in recovery will know, was the solution to the problem. I had social anxiety disorder. I had, a hole the size of a bottle of whiskey, right? That could, I needed to fill. And in recovery, they were saying, well, stopping drinking is just the first step. I go, wow, what's the alternative? Dying drunk. And that seemed more romantic than living sober. It seemed, living sober sounded like a provisional life. I'm alive, but I'm sober. Am I going to start a band sober? I couldn't imagine that. Am I going to go to concerts and have the relationship with music that I had? I couldn't imagine that. And in early sobriety, I hadn't met people who were doing those things. In the young people's movement, I did. I met people who were traveling Europe sober, who were, starting bands or rejoining their bands or starting businesses or going back to school, doing things that made sense to me, right? I could see these people finally had what I wanted, so to speak.
And Joe, how old were you when you started your journey?
I was 14 at my first meeting and was permanently clean and sober by the age of 16. You shake any family tree, one or two drunks fall out of it. Every family's the same. And not only was I not the first alcoholic in my family, I wasn't the first AA member. So my mother and her husband, they were going to AA and trying to sort of spread AA to everyone that they knew were alcoholics, whether they knew it or not. And so it was imposed on me that way, which I rejected until I was invited to help my cousin with recovery. And that seemed like a worthwhile project. And I got sober, helping her get sober. Well, we both got sober. It's a long tradition in AA. It's just not the way it's described as doing the steps in this order by these instructions, because that I only have one story, and that ain't it.
Right. But it helped you.
Yeah. It absolutely did. You see, somehow when I was offered sobriety, I wasn't convinced mine was a life worth saving. I had a very low opinion of myself. I overcompensated with being a hard-ass punk. And it seemed to take so much integrity to get sober. I didn't have any of that, right? I tried to get sober and I couldn't, right? So how is this going to help? But hers was a life worth saving. And I got active in AA and NA, and then we went to young people's conferences and joined a group and started groups and did, speaking at high schools about addiction and recovery. And I got engaged in the community. I became accountable. And it wasn't hard associating myself with people in recovery because my drinking friends weren't calling me up anymore. Hey, Joe, we really missed the good times. Why don't you come pee on our couch and steal our mother's car keys? And remember those good times? Let's do that again, right? So I had time.
Yeah. Right. So let's talk a little bit about, for our listeners, how you define your higher power, because that seems to be a sticking point.
Okay, yeah, I don't in the day-to-day course of things think in terms of spiritual life. I don't know exactly what that means. I don't think in terms of higher power, but I know what it means to other people, and I can speak their language. When I described how I got sober, I had a higher purpose. Helping somebody else that I cared about was a higher purpose, and it was enough reason for me to get sober and stay sober to be a good example and to help somebody else. That will do in a pinch. Higher power can be the power of example, the group of drunks, but it's nothing I sit down and pray to and try to connect to. But it's reality. It's a great higher power. My life, when I was at my worst of addiction, was not in tune with reality. I was in denial of reality. I was distorting reality. And the more I stay in tune with reality, the sort of more grounded I am and the more sober I am. And spirituality, when people describe spirituality to me, but like the AA 12 step is having had a spiritual experience as a result of these steps, ... Well, it would have been a strong enough statement to saying having experienced sobriety as a result of these steps, ... right? Like, what is this whole spiritual thing? And like, people will nod in a meeting, but does everyone agree with what that means? Probably nobody agrees with what that means. Everyone has their own thumbprint-like impression of what spirituality is, and some it involves a supernatural force that they're engaged with, and for some it's the great outdoors or the group of drunks or good orderly direction or any of those sort of secular things. But when people describe the spiritual experience, they seem to be describing the emotional experience. I had existential angst, I had dread, I had despair. Now I have joy, I have awe, I have the sobriety is a wonder, it's not a drag. Well, that's an emotion you're talking to me about, and I can relate to that, and I understand that. But there's nothing wrong with the word spirituality. I'm not on a campaign to stamp it out, but it is an easy way to create like a misunderstanding between two people trying to communicate. And I prefer words that sort of bring us together, where we're seeing eye to eye. And it's one of those words that's just too vague to be. I prefer precise language. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, or at least when I ask different people what their higher power is, 3, 4, 10, 100, I'm always getting answers. So
yeah.
But you're right. It's important to understand the person's language so that you could help guide them through the journey.
Exactly. Like one of the great things about working with others is I can't be empathetic and self-absorbed at the same time. So I was at a meeting, and the only reason it was a traditional meeting in Toronto, Canada, that has been there since 1948. I'm not going to go there and tell them you're doing it all wrong, see it my way. I'm going to share my experience, strength, and hope. And the only reference I made to my own personal worldview is I introduced myself as, my name's Joe, I'm an alcoholic from the Beyond Belief, Agnostics, and Free Thinkers group, right? And, so that was it. Then I told my story, and fellow who introduced me as someone he'd known in recovery for 30 years. And he said, "Oh, I didn't know you were involved with those guys," right? Like there's those guys. It's so tribal in recovery, right? You know, the NA says, "No, we're clean here. We don't use that sober language." And AA goes, "NA, there's no long-term recovery there." It's just not true. That's a myth, right? You know, the smart recovery, some of them are anti-AA and some of them do it along with AA, right? There's and different treatment facilities, I'm sure, badmouth other treatment facilities because they're doing it the wrong way. And it's part of our identity. You know, it's just like if you cheer for a team, there's other teams you don't like, I guess. And that happens in recovery. But I try to be more inclusive than exclusive. And so the fact that this guy who invited me to speak, he never knew that I didn't believe in a prayer answering, sobriety granting God the way he does. It never interfered with our relationship. He can talk to me about his relationship with God, and I don't have to correct him or inform him of my worldview. I can just listen to what he has to say and share my own experience. And that's kind of how it goes. I'm not always an agitator, but I can be when push comes to shove, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. So how might you help others in their recovery journey if they identify as agnostic or an atheist? Go ahead.
Well, I do outreach. I'm currently the member of the sort of board for the International Conference of Secular AA, which just started in 2014 in Santa Monica. And then it was in Austin, Texas in 2016. It was here in Toronto in 2018. And it'll be in Washington, D.C., not far from you, driving distance, in 2020 in the fall. And so it's a gathering. It's an AA conference like any other conference, but there's no praying or anything. It just sort of jump into the panel or jump into the speaker or whatever we do. And so I work in outreach there, right? And just like there's a disconnect in that the secular AA opportunity is one of the best kept secrets, because people, when they refer to AA and have an opinion about AA, they're thinking of a uniformed approach to AA, which usually involves a religious or theistic understanding of how recovery works. And that's true, that you can find that in AA, but it's not AA is there's a unity between a bunch of different groups, not a uniformity where, like at McDonald's, you're going to get the same menu in Richmond, Virginia that you're going to get in LA, that you're going to get in New York or Toronto or London, England, right? AA is like bars, right? Everyone's a little different, right? Some places you walk into, you don't feel comfortable. I'm going to finish my drink, but in other places you come in and you feel like you're home, right? The sort of Cheers thing, right? Everyone knows your name and you wish it didn't close because you just live there. And AA meetings are the same way. You should have a home group that you think this is the best group in the city. That's great. But there's still no reason to badmouth that group down there because they're too conservative or they're too liberal, right? Just, isn't it enough to just be proud of your own group, right? Instead of, sort of dividing people.
Mm-hmm.
So what was your question?
Yeah, maybe we'll just narrow it down a bit. What about the routines or the rituals that you used, as as an agnostic person that's agnostic, that would be helpful. Maybe even just the 12 steps. How did you get over the words or the language in the 12 steps early on, maybe?
Okay, well, in Montreal, I got sober in the AA of its day, and it was really oral tradition. So, yeah, okay, what about these steps? Let's work them out. And step 2, step 3 was, well, what does it mean to you? Okay, good enough. Okay, step 4, right? And there was no debate about, if you're atheist or agnostic or of some other form of, what do they call it? Self-righteousness, we feel sorry for you. Nobody talked to people that way. It was just, kumbaya, to each their own, live and let live. So, I worked the steps. I left the God out. I didn't pray out loud. It didn't seem to be, no one identified that as a problem in my recovery, so I didn't see it as a problem in my recovery. I came to Toronto, and it's more a literalist approach, sort of a big book approach, and I go, whoa, that's not my experience. And people seem to quote the big book like they're borrowing authority. Like, what's wrong with just sharing your experience? It's every bit as legitimate as some dead guy who wrote a book, right? One alcoholic talking to another are two equals who can help each other. So my day-to-day experience is I'm active in my group. I'm active in service work. I've done public information, worked on archives. I actually went to GSO to do some primary research in the history of agnostics and atheists, and the many attempts there were actually to get an atheist agnostic pamphlet, which came up 11 times and got mothballed 11 times. Now there is an atheist agnostic pamphlet. It's called the God Word. And so I find that fascinating. People who succeed in recovery are the people who get engaged. And that might be getting connected with God in some spiritual thing. That's engagement. It could be working with others. That's engagement. It could be doing service work. That's engagement. I pray on my feet, I suppose, is the way I would describe it to a believer, because like I said, if I'm in a state of empathy when I'm caring about another individual, I can't be stuck in my head with my, oh no, my cell phone bill is wrong and I'm angry, or whatever, the little fussy things that go through my head are that make me discontent. I just don't wake up in the morning, and I've never, in all of this time in sobriety, thought, oh man, I wish I drank last night. That would have been so much better. I never regretted it. But I still have to be vigilant about my recovery. You can't get in shape once and stay in shape for the rest of your life. You have to exercise as part of your regular routine. So my 12-step work is that I volunteered at a treatment center to learn, not to, pontificate. And I find that useful. Podcasts. I love podcasts. Hello, podcast listeners. I think this has really changed the world, right? Because niches can connect, right? Like, it could be someone in Nebraska who is a ardent atheist. Like, not only do they not believe in God, they think religion is destructive, and they find AA offensive. Well, where are they going to find like-minded people other than the internet, right? They can find a podcast of like-minded people. They can find go to secularaa.com and join a weekly Zoom meeting of other atheists and agnostics. And I have no problem with mainstream AA. I got sober there, but it's just nice to be in a meeting where I don't have to say, I don't mean to offend anybody, but I just say it how I see it, and I don't have to tiptoe around anything.
Right, and that's something that you might say at other meetings that are more traditional.
Exactly, right? Like God could and would if he existed. Like you say that in a mainstream meeting, you're going to offend somebody, right? But in my worldview, it's a, if it came down to either God created man or mankind in his or hers or theirs or its image, or mankind created God in our image, the second is just more likely, right? There's, I don't want to get into a whole religious debate, but this was something I came to understand when I was smoking drugs and doing acid, right? It seemed clear to me that religion was, sort of a construct based on, existential angst, and it helped people and it gave them community, but it might do good, but it doesn't mean the story doesn't have to be true in order for the result to be beneficial.
I like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's even mythology about AA, about how the big book started and about how AA works. Some people say it's the fellowship, meeting makers make it. Other people say, if you don't work the steps, you're not going to stay sober. And you and I both know people that say, if you don't find a personal God, you're on thin ice. And I don't believe any of those things. I think it's a personal journey.
That is so true. It's going to be different for each person.
Yeah. So like I said, I was at like a regular mainstream AA meeting. I think secular AA is regular mainstream, but even there they say, I don't go to mainstream meetings anymore. And I go, well, what's a mainstream meeting? Even every meeting is completely different than the meeting just down the street from it. And every time they meet, it has a different sort of personality than it did the week before. If you have a chip on your shoulder and you're looking for something, if you're fault finding like there's a reward for it, which I know a lot about, I'm not judging people for doing that, you're going to be able to discredit the meeting for being hypocrites. If you follow me around, you can criticize me for being a hypocrite. I'll say one thing and do the other. That's the human experience. As you know. Oh my God, I'm talking to a counselor. I keep forgetting.
Yeah, that is what I do.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe now, as we're getting close to wrapping up, I can't believe that I have to say that at this point. What are the top 3 books that you have maybe gifted somebody or maybe you've recommended to someone in recovery? I know you sent me a couple via email. I just want to...
Okay, yeah, let me just talk about some of these. If you are secular and you're looking for, sort of common sense way to look at sobriety, I'm going to list a few, but you can Google these. In the 90s, they started. Philip Z. wrote A Skeptic's Guide to the 12 Steps, and Martha Cleveland and another author wrote The Alternative 12 Steps, A Secular Guide to Recovery. John Lauritzen is sober like around 50 years. He wrote a book called A Free Thinker in Alcoholics Anonymous. He was sober in New York when Bill Wilson was still alive. And he's got a really interesting take. There's An Atheist Unofficial Guide to AA. Maria Hornbacher, she's a well-known author. She wrote a book called Waiting and Non-Believers' Higher Power. The Common Sense Recovery by Adam N. Dale Kay took the big book and secularized it. It's called A Secular Sobriety. Steve Kay does a blog, and he's got a book called The 12 Principles of Alcoholics Anonymous. I just interviewed a guy, Jeffrey Munn, who's a counselor like you on the West Coast, who wrote something, I think it's Sober Without God, A Practical Guide to 12 Steps. And he just has a, sort of secular common sense approach to 12-step recovery. Nothing's sacred, nothing's forbidden, right? Like he doesn't badmouth AA. But there's all kinds of, a guy named John Grisham wrote a book called The Principle of Recovery. He's a punk rocker. He's written about punk rock, and this is about it's a memoir. Jovita, who goes to our group, she wrote a book called Drunk Mum, which is a memoir and about her addiction, recovery, relapse. It's a page turner. It's absolutely gripping. There are a couple of dozen books you can get started on if you're complaining, I don't like this 1939 crap. If that's what's standing between you and recovery, check Google and check Amazon again, because there's plenty of others. And now I wrote Beyond Belief, a daily reflection, like Agnostic Musings for 12-Step Life. And there are 2 other agnostic daily reflection books now. So that's great.
That is great. And I will link to all of those books and resources in the show.
Yeah. People should also Google AA Agnostica and AA Beyond Belief. Those are 2 sort of communities where there are blogs and podcasts and book reviews and, some of the politics of the agnostic movement inside of AA, if you want to get into that. And some of the questions you asked, what is higher power, right? Mm-hmm. Do you work the 12 steps and why, and all that sort of stuff. So you're not alone.
You are not alone. That's great. Okay, so as we wrap up, I just want to ask one final question, and then you can tell everyone how we can best find you.
Okay, this always happens to the characters in Columbo. That's when they get in trouble.
Yeah, here we go. If you could write a phrase on a billboard for all to see, what would it say?
All that's necessary. I would borrow something that someone else wrote, that all that is necessary for evil forces to take over this world is for enough good people to do nothing.
For that.
And tomorrow I'd change my mind.
Great. Different billboard. Yeah.
But that's the days. Yeah. Yeah. And if anybody wants to take issue with anything I said, I'm very accessible at news@rebelliondogspublishing.com. And my phone number's on the website. And people are always stunned that I answer the phone, right?
Wow. That's brave.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't always answer the phone because often I'm busy, but I'll get back to people eventually, within a couple of days for sure.
Okay. Well, Joe, thank you so much for being on today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I am so glad you're here. It's an important space, and there's room for more. And bringing a female voice, bringing a trained professional voice, as well as your own lived experience. Kudos, way to go! It's a lot of work. I know it's a lot of work. The hours it takes to make 30 minutes of podcasting, and I'm glad you're out there. The world's a better place. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you so much, Joe.
Thank you for listening to the Atheists in Recovery podcast. For more great info and to stay up to date, head over to atheistsandrecovery.com.